Alright, thanks for tuning into the Dinosaurs Lately podcast, the dinosaur podcast that features periodic updates recapping the latest news on the dinosaurs. My name's Ryan Rogers, and this is the podcast that targets a type of dinosaur and tries to catch you up on everything that's been published on them lately. Welcome to the 7th of these interstitial episodes I've created to keep up with all the dinosaur news, even while I'm not publishing new episodes of the Juras-Sick Park-Cast. I hope it helps you feel more up to date. This is episode 7, Sauropodomorphs, from, looks like winter 2025, recorded on December 24th. That's right, Christmas Eve on 2025. Yeah, jingle, jingle, and all that. Continued thank you to Christoph Oakes of Snail, S-N-A-L-E. Check out his incredible albums on Spotify and Bandcamp. Today's intro is Chinese Cafe from the album Charlemagne, and our outro is Death of a Dream from Snail's self-titled debut album, Snail. Alright, so this time we are catching up on Sauropodomorphs. Let's get started. The story of dinosaurs, as far as it can be told, begins with the story of Sauropodomorphs. These animals are the oldest known representatives of dinosaurs that paleontologists have found, along with some early theropod-like dinosaurs. These were the early line of saurischians, or lizard-hipped dinosaurs, and they were bipedal, nimble, small-headed, and had long tails. And way back in the Late Triassic, in an age called the Carnian, 237 million years ago, these guys were just one of the many animals in the age of archosaurs. Now, archosaurs had taken the forms of phytosaurs, which are semi-aquatic and resemble crocodiles, and rhynchosaurs, which were these triangular-headed herbivorous weirdos with weird teeth and beaks, aedosaurs, which were heavily armored crocodile-like herbivores, I think, and rawisuchians, which were big theropod-headed carnivorous crocodiles. And they all shared the world with non-archosaurs like therapsids, the ancestors of mammals, many of which looked like horribly mutated bulldogs, and 5-foot-long amphibians with the heads big enough to cause serious trouble. And early pterosaurs and horrible insects and, all kinds of just terrible things. And among all of these terrible crocodile-shaped monsters is the dawn of the dinosaurs. Somewhere here, some of these weird crocodile-shaped archosaurs started behaving and looking like the earliest of dinosaurs, and that's exactly what they would go on to become. As they emerged in the Carnian, Sauropodomorphs debuted as bipedal critters, but through an adaptation into herbivory, they found that big guts helped to digest rough plant material, and as a consequence evolved greater mass. And historically, also called prosauropods, these animals resemble the big sauropods like Diplodocus and Brontosaurus by having long necks, long tails, and small heads with distinct teeth. They were among the most successful dinosaurian clades and were one of the most abundant and dominant herbivore components of both the Late Triassic and the Jurassic continental paleo ecosystems, with an almost global distribution, spatially spanning from Antarctica to Greenland. Sauropodomorphs are often depicted as being able to stand on two legs if they were inclined, no pun intended, and they had robust claws on their forelimbs. Our first news story today describes new specimens of one of the earliest of these animals, Saturnalia, in the paper New Specimens of Saturnalia, Tupiniquim, Insights into Intraspecific Variation, Rostral Anatomy, and Skull Size, which was published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society in December 2024. The authors refer new specimens to the species Saturnalia and get a good look at the, quote, rostral anatomy, which is kind of like the animal's snout. In Saturnalia's case, the snout is shorter than other similar sauropodomorphs, and they don't know why. Quote, although the role of this feature is still uncertain, it was kept in the sauropodomorph lineage, becoming even more marked in post-Carnian forms. But finding it apparently revealed, quote, several phylogenetically significant traits, and when the authors ran the new materials through the phylogenetic analysis machine, it came as a Saturnalia, quite nicely. Further supporting the referral, the new specimen UFSM 11660 was also excavated from the type locality of Saturnalia Tupiniquim 2. So they're pretty confident with this. The skull is incomplete, but they estimate it may have been about 104 millimeters in length, with a maxilla of 46.5 millimeters. So that's only about 10 centimeters long, making this not very big little dinosaur. The next story is a new dinosaur from Wyoming, where they were excited to find a Carnian-aged animal that wasn't South American for a change. The authors say, quote, the paucity or lack of recognition of Carnian-aged strata in the northern hemisphere has hindered the ability to test dispersal hypotheses of early late Triassic faunas, leading to centers of origin hypotheses. Obviously, if more fossils were found in Carnian-aged strata in different parts of the world, paleontologists could get a more accurate hypothesis on dispersal hypotheses for late Triassic faunas, and this new discovery is offering a, quote, rare window into terrestrial environments of equatorial Pangaea during this time. This new dinosaur is, quote, unequivocally the oldest known low-latitude dinosaur globally and casts doubt on proposed limits to the dispersal potential of early sauropodomorphs and provides a, quote, rare window into the terrestrial environments of equatorial Pangaea during this time. Named Avadum banduivec, based on the fossils UWGM 1975/UWGM 7549, this is the oldest Laurasian dinosaur, which was uncovered from the Papo-Agi Formation, which the authors say high-precision radioisotopic detrital ages measure this rock formation to 230 million years old, making these discoveries the first unequivocal Carnian-aged sauropodomorph dinosaur comparable in age to the oldest dinosaur faunas of Gondwana. Its discovery challenges the hypothesis of a delayed dinosaurian dispersal out of high-latitude Gondwana, and thus demonstrates a widespread geographic distribution for sauropodomorphs by the mid-late Carnian. The holotype UWGM 1975 is housed at the University of Wisconsin's Geology Museum, and it was uncovered from the Papua New Guinea Formation. It's comprised of an isolated left astragalus, and the authors also referred the proximal end of a left femur, UWGM 7549, due to its, quote, clear Saurischian affinities. The femur bit was found within a 5 millimeter radius of the type specimen and encrusted with a similar micritic carbonate. These bits of left foot are not cool looking, they just look like rocks. But it's exciting how these dull-looking rocks can be so significant in the macroevolutionary story of sauropodomorphs and dinosaurs in general. The next article is a long-necked early dinosaur from a newly discovered Upper Triassic basin in the Andes, published in the Journal of Nature in October 2025. This new animal is named Hyracursor jaguensis, and, quote, compared to its generally small and short-necked Carnian counterparts, it is larger and exhibits an incipient elongation of its cervical vertebrae, representing an intermediate condition for size and cervical elongation between known Carnian and Norian sauropodomorphs. The authors are saying this discovery provides one of the oldest pieces of evidence of increased body mass and neck elongation in early sauropodomorpha. With the last dinosaur, they only found a bit of foot. In this dinosaur, they found almost the entire skeleton. But the most interesting and telling part is the neck elongation. Quote, neck elongation and increased body mass are two key traits in the early evolution of Sauropodomorpha, and their first major development may have occurred within a 5 to 8 million year window between the Carnian and Norian, say the authors. Quote, the earliest known sauropodomorphs were around 10 kilograms and had relatively short necks compared with the much larger Norian taxa. Some Carnian sauropodomorphs from southern Brazil, including Bagualosaurus and other fragmentary specimens, have been proposed as transitional forms exhibiting either cervical elongation or increased body mass. However, more complete specimens and accurate ages of the strata they derive from are mandatory to understand the tempo and mode of these evolutionary shifts. Hyracursor stands out among the oldest sauropodomorphs for its large body size, surpassing its contemporaries from the Ishigualasto Formation and reaching a mass comparable to Bagualosaurus. Conversely, Hyracursor preserves an almost complete cervical series, revealing elongation ratios. Its combination of traits suggests that the acquisition of larger body size and neck elongation did not occur as separate sequential events, but were already linked by the earliest dinosaur occurrences in the late Carnian. And the last Carnian-aged news story is sort of unrelated to Carnian sauropodomorphs, but it was looking at some of these early animals to see what can be understood in the giant sauropods of the late Jurassic. One of the elements that helped Brachiosaurus and Brontosaurus get so damned big was that they evolved postcranial skeletal pneumaticity within elements along the axial skeleton. In the paper, New Information on Late Triassic Sauropodomorph Dinosaurs provides support for the independent acquisition of postcranial skeletal pneumaticity in avimetatarsalian lineages, published in the Journal of Anatomy in August 2025, the authors wanted to see where and when this pneumaticity started. It has been hypothesized that, quote, to facilitate the evolution of long necks and large body size, sauropodomorphs evolved postcranial skeletal pneumaticity within elements along the axial skeleton. This is their explanation of pneumaticity. Their explanation of pneumaticity goes thusly. Pneumaticity occurs via a respiratory air sac system, wherein air sacs branch into smaller pneumatic diverticula, which are lined with pneumatic bone structure. The latter is able to pneumatize bone, thereby invading skeletal elements and replacing the spongious part of the bone with air. And this has been observed in sauropods, in theropods, and also in pterosaurs. In any case, in this study, the authors used the remains of Thecodontosaurus antiquus, Pantidraco caducus, Rulea bedheimensis, and Plateosaurus longiceps. They say several conclusions can be drawn from their observations. First, in early branching late Triassic sauropodomorphs, postcranial skeletal pneumaticity appears in neural arches of the cervical vertebrae, and in more derived forms, this extends along the vertebral column. They conclude that this pneumaticity appears to, quote, show a broad phylogenetic signal with increased development in later branching sauropodomorphs. We find no link between pneumaticity and body size in early branching sauropodomorphs. This pneumaticity isn't observed in Carnian sauropodomorphs, even though it's observed in theropods and lagirpatids, or the early pterosaurs. But pneumaticity does appear in sauropodomorphs in the Norean age, a few million years later. The authors say this quote provides additional support for the idea that postcranial pneumaticity evolved independently in 3 avametatarsian lineages. All right, we're going to move past the Carnian, go into the next stage of the late Triassic, the Norean. Here in the Norean, we have some of the earliest sauropodomorphs too, which had already diversified and traversed much of the southern supercontinent of Pangaea. Leyesaurus was first described in 2011, and the new species was erected on the holotype PVSJ706, housed at the Instituto y Museo de Ciencias Naturales in the Universidad Nacional de San Juan. The fossils were excavated from the Quebrada del Barro Formation. It's comprised of a nearly complete skull with articulated mandible and the vertebral columns, scapular and pelvic girdles, and hind limb. My records say this sauropodomorph was about 8 feet long, so the length of a lion, but the shape of a long-necked otter, perhaps, if you're trying to imagine it. In the paper Leyesaurus mariensis from Northwestern Argentina, an update, in a July edition of the journal Emenginiana, the authors provide an update on this dinosaur. The authors say that these early sauropodomorph dinosaurs, quote, exhibit a diverse array of morphological traits that mark the transition from small bipedal animals to gigantic quadrupedal sauropods. And among them, the, quote, Gondwanan forms play a particularly crucial role in determining the evolutionary trajectories of this lineage. Gondwana is the southern supercontinent during the Mesozoic era, and during the age of Pangaea, try and imagine that Antarctica, Chile, and South Africa were all touching, like those fingertips of God and Adam on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And then southwestern continental Africa and southeastern continental America were connected. This southern end of Pangaea is a, quote, hotspot for early sauropodomorph diversification, says the paper, where, quote, ecological conditions gave rise to a wealth of sauropodomorph taxa. Leyesaurus was described from a single specimen that demonstrated unique insights into the anatomy, phylogeny, and paleoecology of early sauropodomorphs, and this paper provides an update on what's been learned since its description in 2011. First, work on the sedimentary layers and stratigraphy of the unit Leyesaurus was discovered has been revised, and the present interpretation is the, quote, basin was formed during a time of increasing aridity and included several continental fluvial-alluvial paleoenvironments. This means the depositional environment was created by a stream or a river during a cycle when it was drying up. Now, the, quote, Norean categorization that makes this such an old specimen isn't a perfect science. As I understand it, the Quebrada del Barro Formation, in which Leyesaurus was uncovered, is matched to other neighboring formations like the Los Colorados, which is a very similar faunal composition, and so it's believed that they may be of similar ages. The Los Colorados is believed to be Norean, so it's reasonable to interpret the Quebrada del Barro as similar. However, in this new study, they say, quote, a more recent stratigraphic revision of the southeastern part of the San Juan province has revealed that the Mareas el Carrizal Basin contains 6 formations, arranged from the base to the top as follows. And recall that these are 6 layers on top of each other, with the oldest on the bottom and the youngest on the top. The first is the Esquina Colorada, the second is the Carrizal, the third is our layer here with Leyesaurus in it, the Quebrada del Barro, then there's the Quebrada del Puma, the Balde de Leyes, which is a layer we're going to talk about again shortly, and Rancho Grande. The authors add that the 5th layer, the Balde de Leyes formation, has yielded, quote, several isolated sauropodomorph remains in its lower part. Based on this early sauropodomorph assemblage, the Balde de Leyes formation is considered to be of early Jurassic or Hettangian age. But Ryan, you're thinking, didn't you just tell us that Leyesaurus is from the Norean age of the late Triassic, and didn't you spend all that time setting the stage with all those details about Phytosaurus and Rauisuchians? Why are you mentioning the Hettangian, which is 20 million years later? Why would you go through all that trouble if this dinosaur isn't from the Norean age? And to that, I'll just tell you, I don't know. This is a little unclear, but it appears that of these 6 layers, some new isolated sauropodomorph remains appear to correspond to massospondylid remains for an early Jurassic formation in South Africa. In this way, the authors can positively correlate one of these 6 layers to the Hatangian age, which is very useful, even though it's technically unrelated to Leyesaurus in a Leyesaurus paper. I think that's what's going on there. To double check, I went back to the original 2011 paper, a basal sauropodomorph in the Quebrada del Barro Formation, Northwestern Argentina, which first described Leyesaurus. And in that paper, they described the Quebrada del Barro Formation thusly. The Quebrada del Barro Formation tops the sequence with 900 to 1400 meters of reddish alluvial fan deposits that are mostly fine conglomerates in sandstone. The age of this unit was originally proposed as Cretaceous and later as Upper Triassic. In 1978, Bassi and Bonaparte assigned a Norian age for Quebrada del Barro Formation, based on the discovery of some vertebrate remains questionably assigned to Riojasaurus. So the real answer is that this is an update, but it's not the answer. The formation has been considered Cretaceous, Late Triassic, back in the late 1970s, and now it's possibly Early Jurassic. In the end, don't ever forget that they're looking at chunks of rock that are hundreds of millions of years old. There is a lot of interpretation going on, so it relies heavily on the work of peers from all around the globe to piece the answers together. But what are the updates on the dinosaur, more specifically? The authors say that the original interpretation of Leyesaurus as a sister taxon to Adiopapasaurus, which is a fun name to say, is reinforced by their present phylogenetic analyses, and that they are confidently identified as massospondylid sauropodomorphs, and that they share 2 unambiguous synapomorphies that support that interpretation, which is good. These similarities also reinforce that they may come from a common age, even though they are from distinct, though proximal, rock formations, which suggests this is a Hatangian animal from the early Jurassic, not the Norian of the late Jurassic. And the holotype specimen of Leyesaurus PV-SJ706 has been interpreted to be 6 years old when it died, whereas the other specimens are believed to also be Leyesaurus are also interpreted as being about 20 years old. So there you go. Sticking to the Norian with an animal we can more confidently say was from the old late Triassic is the resplendent and bountiful sauropodomorph Plateosaurus. It is one of the best known dinosaurs from Europe due to the large number of articulated skeletons discovered from bone bed horizons in Switzerland and Germany. Plateosaurus exhibits high degrees of developmental plasticity, which makes investigations of specimen life histories from gross morphology alone difficult. So what do you do when you discover a Plateosaurus trascengensis specimen that has, quote, an almost complete series of tail vertebrae with a well-preserved articulated whip-like distal end? Well, if you were the authors of the next paper, you'd know the preserved tail structure provides valuable insights into the morphological implications of tail function and its potential role in the behavior of Plateosaurus. In the article Tail of Defense, an almost complete tail skeleton of Plateosaurus reveals possible defense strategies, published in Royal Society Open Science in May 2025. The authors used the caudal vertebrae and reconstructed and analyzed the, quote, potential tail lashing capabilities of Plateosaurus, comparing its biomechanics with those of other fossil and extant long-tailed reptilian taxa, including the extinct sauropod Diplodocus, the extant Asian water monitor Varanus salvator, and the green iguana iguana. The research was done on a specimen mounted at the Natural History Museum, Vienna, but it doesn't have an accession number, so it's referred to by its field number, Frick field number 15.5. The study found the tails were highly flexible, with an estimated kinetic energy output during rapid strikes comparable to the defensive tail use observed in modern reptiles. Quote, these findings suggest that tail whipping may have played a role in predator deterrence or intraspecific interactions in Plateosaurus. Quote, given its herbivorous diet and the absence of armor or obvious defense structures such as osteoderms, horn shields, or spikes, Plateosaurus may have been comparatively more vulnerable to predation than contemporaneous taxa equipped with such features, say the authors. They suggest herd formations and active self-defense using both the claws and tail could have been viable strategies, what with Plateosaurus having long, curved hand claws, quote, typically associated with grasping. They say the tail is estimated to have consisted of approximately 45 caudal vertebrae, accounting for about 45% of its body length, and was possibly held horizontally. The quantity of vertebrae encourages an interpretation of flexibility, allowing for a lateral deflection of up to 45 degrees in the proximal 10 caudal vertebrae relative to the horizontal axis. This defense mechanism has been theorized in other long-tailed animals like Diplodocus, which had 80 caudal vertebrae, and Diplodocus studies have said that the supersonic cracking sounds were possible given the physical extremes the elongate tail possessed. But this paper isn't about Diplodocus. The authors said their findings are supported by integrating anatomical and functional data in their behavioral reconstruction, and that their study contributes to a better understanding of Plateosaurus's tail functions, even if the interpretation remains hypothetical in the absence of direct fossil evidence. And I'll offer a perspective not mentioned by the authors, but there's something to be said for having a 35-foot-long animal weighing 4,000 pounds smash you with its tail. It would not be unlike being struck by a mid-sized sedan. No matter the speed, the mass of the collision is already going to be a big concern. So there's some perspective on that. The next Plateosaurus paper is Osteology and Histology of a Plateosaurus trascendensis from the Upper Triassic of Switzerland with an advanced chronic pathology, published in the Swiss Journal of Palaeontology in June 2025. This Plateosaurus specimen is also from Frick, Switzerland. Excavation ID SMF 18.1. Collection NMZ 100. Oh, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Collection NMZ 1000001, which is housed at the Natural History Museum of the University of Zurich. It's a different specimen than the last story, but the same type of animal from the same area in Switzerland, though found at a different quarry. While many plesiosaur fossils have been uncovered, few have been, quote, rigorously examined for possessing any evidence of pathology, i.e. injury or disease, that could provide insight into how these dinosaurs lived. So that's what these authors did, and also what they wrote about. The NMZ 1000001 specimen, which they believe was around about 23 to 25 years of age when it died, about 25 feet long, and it was found to have, quote, an unusual pathology in its right scapula and proximal portion of the right humerus. This is interpreted to be a bone tissue infection, and the authors say, quote, based on the size and extent of the infected area, it is likely one of the most advanced cases known from the fossil record. And they added it's, quote, one of the stratigraphically earliest known occurrences of osteomyelitis in dinosaurs. Finally, in their review, they observed that this specimen, quote, may have attained skeletal maturity at a younger age than previous histological sectioned specimens indicated, which suggests not only, quote, greater developmental plasticity in Plateosaurus than previously thought, but further highlights the need for in-depth investigations on greater numbers of specimens to fully account for the morphological variation and developmental plasticity exhibited by this sauropodomorph. Based on the lines of arrested growth in the bone sections, the specimen was believed to have reached skeletal maturity by about 13 years of age, whereas earlier studies on other specimens suggested skeletal maturity may have been attained between 16 and 21 years of age. So a little disagreement with previous studies. The last two Plateosaurus articles were about Trascendensis species, but the next one is on Plateosaurus ornatus, named by von Huene in 1908, in the article Reassessment of Plateosaurus ornatus, an early ornithischian from the Rhaetian bed, published in the Annual Journal of the Society for Natural History in Württemberg, published in December 2024. In this paper, the authors reevaluated a Plateosaurus specimen from southwestern Germany, which is near the Frick locality in northern Switzerland, in the European geography point of view. And let's be clear, this article isn't making some grand claim that Plateosaurus is actually a basal ornithischian and rewriting the phylogenetic tree of life. In simple terms, sauropodomorphs and theropods are the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, and ornithischians are the bird-hipped ones. Reclassifying a sauropodomorph as bird-hipped would turn the entire world on its ear. This paper isn't doing that, though. This is maybe like an academic version of the clickbait title. That it's written entirely in German only further exasperates the curiosity as to what this paper is saying, but simply, the authors were reviewing von Huene's Plateosaurus ornatus monotype, an isolated maxillary or dentary tooth crown, though the specimen is now lost. And quote, the illustrations and descriptions of the specimen clearly show that Plateosaurus ornatus possesses a pronounced cingulate at the base of the tooth crown, an unambiguous autapomorphy of ornithischian or bird-hipped dinosaurs. And it's not just that. Once the researchers started comparing ornatus with ornithischian characteristics, they were confident this taxon is a valid species of a previously unknown genus of an ornithischian. Quote, within the Ornithischia, the form shows striking similarity to highly derived armored dinosaurs and Chilosauridae. Due to the loss of the holotype, naming is omitted until new material is found that allows the establishment of a neotype. There are no relationships to Plateosaurus or other prosauropods. The age of the specimen can only be narrowed down to the latest Late Triassic, like the Late Rhaetian, to the lowest Early Jurassic, the Early Hatangian. Nevertheless, Plateosaurus ornatus is one of the world's oldest ornithischians. The next few articles are more generally about sauropodomorphs as a family, focused on studies of particular parts of the family's anatomy and aren't especially beholden to any particular species, starting with evolution of the Sauropodomorph astragalus, relationships with the emergence of the sauropod bowplan, and weight-bearing functions and critical appraisal of evolutionary rate estimation, published in the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society in August 2025. The authors remind us Sauropodomorphs began as smaller bipedal animals, but evolved into huge elephant-sized animals, and of course, beyond that, evolved into sauropods proper, the largest terrestrial animals of all time. Their evolution towards gigantism was associated with acquisition of specialized features, notably the columnar limbs. However, their tarsus, mainly represented by the astragalus, and I looked up the proper pronunciation because I've said this word a few different ways over the span of this podcast, but it's astragalus, not a dress. Their astragalus has received little attention despite its crucial position and role in limb architecture. So that's what these authors did by investigating the shape of these bones in a, quote, large sample of Sauropodomorph astragali to assess how its morphology evolved through time and with the emergence of the sauropod bowplan. And this is pretty interesting. Quote, acquisition of sauropod-related features was stepwise. If I break this down correctly, and that's a big if, the big step is the diversification of the, quote, hind limb zygopod. And what is that? That's a great question. It's the middle section of a limb. Think of the tibia and fibula in your hind limb, or the radius and ulna in your forelimbs. Apparently, it's changes in zygopodal section of the Sauropodomorphs that create the, quote, marked distinction and diversification of the eusauropod subclade. So, this first step is a distinct evolutionary marker in the macroevolutionary development of sauropods. Step 2, variations to the limbs adapted to weight-bearing constraints with, quote, flatter distal articular surfaces marks what is generally referred to as columnar limbs. And columnar limbs are essential for supporting much heavier animals. And step 3 is what they call subhorizontal pes orientation, which is comparable to what you find in elephants, or in other words, it's the evolution of an extensive foot pad. And the authors are clear that much of this is hypothetical. So those are the 3 steps to adapt from a prosauropod into a true sauropod. And the ankles tell us quite a story. How about the wrists? The next article is Osteology of the Appendicular Skeleton of Macrocollum itachii, sheds light on the early dinosaur wrist evolution. Also in the Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society, this time in September 2025, and by totally different authors. The authors have Macrocollum itachii fossils that are, quote, exquisitely preserved specimens from early Norian beds of southern Brazil, which they say is a, quote, crucial taxon for understanding sauropodomorph evolution. Macrocollum is a sauropodomorph named in 2012 on fossils from the Brazilian Candelera sequence. The holotype CAPPA/UFSM0001A housed at the Laboratorio de Estratigrafia y Paleobiologia, Universidade Federal de Santa Maria, is comprised of an almost complete and articulated skeleton. It's named for having a long neck, which is macro, meaning big or large, and collum is Latin for neck. Quote, this species provides a glimpse at the transition between the earliest sauropodomorphs and the classic prosauropods, and they wanted to describe its appendicular anatomy in detail. And you'll remember the term appendicular from episode 6, Small-Bodied Ornithopods, where we found appendicular refers to the core of the body and its appendages. And the authors provide a detailed description of Macrocollum's appendicular skeleton, finding it has some exciting, quote, plesiomorphic traits, as well as, quote, derived traits, and a fresh phylogenetic analysis supports its classification as a eunaeosaurid member of the Plateosaurian Sauropodomorphs. Eunaeosaurids are very early sauropodomorphs for having a substantially expanded femur tip by the ankle and an extra skull opening between the nose and the antorbital fenestra. The specimen they worked with demonstrated that sauropodomorphs, like other dinosaur groups, ancestrally possessed at least 9 carpals. Carpals are hand bones, which compose your palm, and the metacarpals are sort of what help give you knuckles, and the phalanges are your fingers. Turns out most dinosaurs ancestrally had 9 carpals, and you and me, and well, definitely me, and probably you, have 8 carpals. Just one of those things that separate us from the dinosaurs, I guess. Dinosaurs obviously evolved over tens of millions of years to lose carpals and change their hands and fingers in all kinds of ways. But the earliest Saurischians, in any case, had the ancestral 9 carpals to start. For example, Camarasaurus, a late Jurassic sauropod of the Morrison Formation, had 2 carpals, and Titanosaurus, the latest surviving late Cretaceous sauropods of them all, had 0 carpals. They walked around on stumps of metacarpal bones. The macroevolutionary story of being the biggest, heaviest terrestrial animals of all time meant an incredible reduction in their hand and fingers, relieving them of the burden of any dexterity for the purposes of supporting their incredible weight. But basal sauropodomorphs hadn't yet evolved their hands away into crutches. they would have retained some facility with their forelimbs in theory. Quote, this finding enhances our understanding of carpal morphology and evolution within sauropodomorphs, say the authors. Quote, Macrocollum reveals the presence of a unique third phalanx of manual digit 5, raising the questions about the confidence we can infer the phalangeal counts of the outermost digits. So here you go, hands and feet. The next news story describes a new sauropodomorph found in the mass accumulation site of the Plateosaurus tracingensis, familiar to us from the first couple of news items we just spoke about, in Switzerland. The paper Cranio-Mandibular Osteology of a New Massapodan Sauropodomorph from the Late Triassic of Canton Aargau, Switzerland, was published in the Swiss Journal of Palaeontology in 2025, and this news article describes, quote, the complete craniomandibular anatomy of an articulated skull, SMF, 13.5.37, belonging to a partial skeleton, SMF 13.5. And it's housed in the Saurier-Museum Frick in Frick, Switzerland. The authors use microcomputed tomography scans as well as segmentation techniques to examine inaccessible craniodental features of the snout of the specimen under study. They report finding, quote, unique mosaic-like combination of plesiomorphic and apomorphic craniomandibular features, implying that the cranial anatomy of SMF 13.5.37 is transitional between non-Massapodon Plateosaurian and Massapodon Sauropodomorph morphologies, similarly to the Argentinian Coloradosaurus brevis from the mid to late Norian of the Los Colorados Formation. What does non-Massapodon Plateosaurian mean? Basically, Plateosaurus is an abundant and well-known animal with multiple named species and lots of specimens. It's also well detailed that it has well-established and well-populated branch on the family tree alto itself. They are called Plateosauridae, and sister to Plateosauridae is Massapoda, which is basically all the rest of the sauropodomorphs more derived than Plateosaurus that aren't Plateosaurus. The rest of the sauropodomorphs that aren't either of those things are more primitive and generally called Sauropodomorpha, and they're basal and ancestral forms. So SMF 13.5.37 is the first non-Plateosaurus sauropodomorph from this rock formation and the fourth late Triassic non-sauropodon sauropodomorph of Switzerland, meaning this is a basal species, but the mosaic craniomandibular anatomy shares similarities with the mid to late Norian Massaspondylid Coloradosaurus brevis, which isn't from Colorado, but rather from the Colorado Mountains of Argentina, but nonetheless still from a significantly different part of Pangaea than Switzerland. So, this complicates the animal a little bit. It's basal and perhaps a transitional form, but it also has this unique mosaic of features which are very similar to another species found sort of in the same time frame, but from a totally different part of Pangaea, which sort of refutes the meaning of unique, but we know what the authors are getting at here. These are special features, and it's perhaps surprising to find them shared between two animals so geographically disparate. The phylogenetic analysis machine scores this new animal as a Massapodon sauropodomorph, branching out at the basal nodes of Massapoda, and it makes it, quote, the first non-sauropoda-form Massapodon from Laurasia. The authors say, quote, remarkably, the resulting macroevolutionary scenario opens up a plausible hypothesis supporting a European origin for the early Jurassic Massapodons from Asia during the late Triassic, although more evidence is required to corroborate it. Moreover, SMF 13.5.37 increases both the craniodental disparity and paleobiodiversity of Norian sauropodomorphs from Laurasia, with the latter being comparable to those from Gondwana, especially South America and Africa. Or in other words, the connection between this animal and one from the other side of Pangaea, which is now Argentina, indicates a much broader paleodiversity for Norian sauropodomorphs from Laurasia. Now, it sounds like they're hypothesizing with the understanding that some further analysis will be influential in whether they're in support or not. Quote, in order to properly define the final phylogenetic placement of this new taxon and to further test the presented macroevolutionary implication, the description of the postcranium of SMF 13.5 is essential, as it could alter its constituency and relationships. Furthermore, the anatomical comparisons with other sauropodomorph specimens known only from fragmentary postcranial specimens will be needed to evaluate potential synonymousness with SMF 13.5, given the geographic proximity and the possible stratigraphic similarity of the three taxa, all of which assigned to the latest Norian. Perhaps after all that analysis, they'll finally go ahead and name this thing, right? They didn't do that yet. All right, out of the Triassic and into the Jurassic, starting with the earliest Jurassic time, the Hatangian, about 201 to 199 million years ago, just a quick couple million years in there. The early Jurassic is marked by a significant extinction event, through which many of the Triassic species that are so strange and unfamiliar looking disappeared, but dinosaurs survived. And in the absence of competition, the dinosaurs inherited the Earth. I don't know all the details, but it involved a lot of volcanoes and sulfur and acidity, basically everywhere. How bad were the volcanoes? Geologists have found an outpouring of lava that occurred 200 million years ago, which is basically a continuous, uniform body of magma that was given the name Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP. This is the Earth's largest continental flood basalt event, coinciding with the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea and the opening of the Atlantic Ocean. So if you can imagine the supercontinent of Pangaea being ripped apart by tectonic forces, and the wound in the crust that resulted from the tear was filled with this incredible volume of magma and all the gases and poisons that come with it. But this is when the rift between Africa and South Africa splits them apart. And this wasn't like a dry summer or something like that. This was a terrible series of millennia of fire and ash and magma and sulfur and poison. That was the end Triassic extinction event. And dinosaurs somewhere out there survived this, but not necessarily in Switzerland and Wyoming and Argentina, where the earlier animals are all known from. After the end Triassic extinction, we start finding dinosaurs in China. So the next news article is a new species of Xingxiulong from the Lower Jurassic Lufeng Formation of Yunnan Province, China, published in the Journal of Historical Biology in February 2025. So the truth about Xingxiulong is that this is a new species but not a new genus. Xingxiulong Chengai was named back in 2013, but upon reviewing the specimens more closely, it became apparent that one of the three animals they'd uncovered wasn't quite the same species. In this case, the author's name is Xingxiulong Yuirum, based on holotype LF 2015-NO01, uncovered from the Zhangjiao member of the Lufeng Formation in the Yunnan Province of southwestern China. It's comprised of an articulated postcranial skeleton with 13 dorsal vertebrae, 11 of those paired with dorsal ribs, 4 sacral vertebrae, 20 caudal vertebrae with chevrons, a partial left scapula, and both complete pelvis girdles and hind limbs. The name Xingzhu refers to the Xingzhu Bridge, or the Constellation Bridge, and Long is Chinese for dragon, and Yuiurum is Latin for honoring the brothers and sisters of Shuyong Yui for their great efforts on collecting, preparing, and protecting the fossils. Shuyong Yui was also acknowledged for taking photographs and measurements of the fossils for the paper. So this new specimen was found in the Lufeng Basin, in which the Lufeng Formation is subdivided into an upper and lower member, named the Shaowen member and the Zhangjiao member, respectively. These members have different colored rock and thickness, so they're distinct. And X Chengai from 2013 was excavated from the Shaowen member, while the new animal was found in the Zhangjiao member. And they've got some distinguishing differences on their bones, but they're still really similar, and the relationship between these two species revealed itself during the phylogenetic analysis results. Thus, the new specimens were named a species of an already erected genus. The new animal is maybe 30 feet long, which is pretty big, making it, quote, relatively large, early sauropodomorph. From a macroevolutionary lens, the both Xingxiulong species have 4 sacral vertebrae, which is a feature typically associated with late diverging sauropodoforms and sauropods. It indicates that this species may have a complex evolution within the sauropodomorphs. The authors recall that this 4 sacral vertebrae feature was evolved over a series of 3 steps by big sauropods to get bigger. But to find them in early Jurassic sauropodomorphs challenges that assumption. They started with 2 primordial sacral vertebrae, then in most non-sauropodomorphs, 3 sacral vertebrae are present, with 1 dorsosacral and 2 primordial sacrals in most taxa, and third, in sauropods, another caudosacral is developed, and 4 or more sacrals are present. Quote, however, as more and more specimens are discovered, 4 sacral vertebrae are found to be evolved invariably in some non-sauropodomorphs. Quote, according to the result of the phylogenetic analysis during the early evolutionary stages of sauropodomorphs, different taxa experienced at least several independent increases in the number of sacral vertebrae. Meanwhile, the relationship between the increase in the number of sacral vertebrae and gigantism is not as close as previously thought. As a medium to large size early diverging sauropodomorph, Xingxiulong Chengai also has 4 sacral vertebrae, which shows that in the early evolution of sauropodomorphs, different branches had the possibility of increasing sacral vertebrae, which may be prerequisite for gigantism, but not an inevitable condition. Quote, this indicates that gigantism appears to have independently evolved in both non-sauropodon sauropodomorphs and sauropods. The next news story is a totally new dinosaur with a fun name, the Wudinglong Wui, sauropodomorph from China. Published in the journal Scientific Reports in July 2025 was the paper A New Early Jurassic Dinosaur Represents the Earliest Diverging and Oldest Sauropodomorph of East Asia. Named after the Wuding County, near where it was discovered, Wuding-Long Wui was named based on the holotype LFGT-YW002, housed at the Center for Dinosaur Research and Protection, Bureau of Natural Resources of Lufeng City. It was uncovered from the Yubakun Formation, and it is comprised of a partial skeleton including skull and mandible, atlas axis, 3rd to 10th cervical vertebrae, 1st to the 7th dorsal vertebrae, dorsal ribs, right scapula, and coracoid, right forelimb including humerus, ulna, radius, and manus. The rest of the name uses Long, which is Chinese for dragon, and Wui honors Dr. Xiaochun Wu at the Canadian Museum of Nature and his contributions to the fossils of Yunnan Province. And if I know anything about connections between China and the Canadian Museum of Nature, it's through a guest of the show, Dr. Jordan Mallon, who is one of the authors on that incredible Rapinomamus mammal that was fossilized terrorizing a Psittacosaurus, which you may recall from episode 65, Epilogue, San Jose. In that episode, Dr. Mallon shared about the Rapinomamus that he and other researchers from the Canadian Museum of Nature were publishing on at the time, and sure enough, Dr. Xiaochun Wu is the lead author from that study too. So, this dinosaur is named in honor of an author whose work we have covered on the show before, which is cool. This discovery means that Wuding-Long represents the, quote, earliest diverging and stratigraphically oldest sauropodomorph dinosaur discovered in East Asia, and it provides, quote, further evidence that the southwestern China sauropodomorph assemblage is one of the most taxonomically diverse and morphologically disparate in the pre-Toarcian Early Jurassic worldwide, represented by various taxa from near the base of the Massopoda and non-sauropodon sauropod forms. The next news stories are related to the more commonly known Massospondylus from South Africa that was described in the 19th century and being a staple in the sauropodomorph discussion ever since. This critter was discovered in the Elliott Formation, which is a formation where the age is still only broadly understood. It could be as old as a Hatangian, making it more than 200 million years old, or possibly Pliensbachian, which is 182 million years old. So there's like a 15 million year uncertainty in there, So the first paper here is A Brief History of Massospondylus, Its Discovery, Historical Taxonomy, and Redescription of the Original Syntype Series by terrific guest of episode 70, the Inside Man, Dr. Paul Barrett. It was published in the Journal of Palaeontologica Africana in June 2024. In this paper, a redescription of Massospondylus is warranted because, quote, the taxon was poorly characterized and rarely discussed until relatively recently. This neglect was due, at least in part, to the poor quality of the original syntype series, which consisted of isolated and often broken elements of uncertain association that were destroyed during World War II. So the authors reevaluated the collection of material that yielded the syntypes of Massospondylus carinatus, Leptospondylus capensis, and Pachyspondylus orpini, as well as the, quote, material that Richard Owen and others referred to each of these taxa historically based on the plaster casts of these specimens that survive in museum collections in London and Cape Town. With the long history of discoveries and referrals and synonymizations, recapping and summarizing everything into a common paper feels useful, and especially if authors were planning to do future work in this arena, this type of work would be very useful. So all the original features were remeasured and re-reported, and they're ready to be accessed when called upon in the name of science. Quote, although the original syntype series of Massospondylus carinatus was destroyed in World War II, these specimens are represented in part by a series of casts and illustrations. Examination of the casts, many of which are figured in detail for the first time, reveals that none possess any features that are currently considered to be diagnostic for this taxon. Instead, they represent a collection of indeterminate sauropodomorph and dinosaur remains. Some of these elements also differ in morphology from the more complete specimens that are now generally considered to represent M. carinatus, like the neotype BP1/4934. Ultimately, the discovery of new specimens provided, quote, fresh impetus to include Massospondylus in phylogenetic and paleobiological analyses and to provide fuller descriptions, although the referrals of these specimens to Massospondylus were made on a weak foundation, say the authors. And furthermore, some unique species were being referred to Massospondylus as a result of comparing specimens against the undiagnostic syntypes all these years. The paper hopes that, quote, the designation of a neotype has helped to stabilize the situation. Further studies are required to assess how many of the numerous referred specimens are genuinely referable to what we now regard as M. carinatus, not least as the ontogenetic and intraspecific variation of this material is poorly understood, especially if we are to determine the true species richness of the early Jurassic dinosaur faunas from southern Africa in which it purportedly occurs. All right, in the paper, Massospondylus embryos and hatchling provide insights into early sauropodomorph ontogeny, published in the Swiss Journal of Palaeontology in August 2025. The authors report on a discovery of embryonic, eggshell, and hatchling material of the early Jurassic sauropodomorph Massospondylus. The research provides, quote, new insights into the early life stages of early diverging sauropodomorphs. First, the prominent thumb, typical of early diverging sauropodomorph dinosaurs, also appears to be precociously ossified and ontogenetically variable, which means they surprisingly had very rigid and firm thumbs at an embryonic age, unlike most of the rest of their hand and foot elements. The authors find that hatchlings would have had an obligate quadrupedal posture, and the resulting growth trajectory points to an important ontogenetically influenced ecological shift predicted on the continuum of locomotory dependent postural change, meaning they'd mature and become obligate bipeds. Compared with other late Triassic and early Jurassic sauropodomorphs known from different ontogenetic stages, this pattern appears to be consistent. The differences between species appear to be, quote, only modest variations in skull, neck, and limb proportions, but otherwise their, quote, conservative body plan likely suggests a similar posture change for the early members of this large clade that preceded the obligate quadruped sauropods. The prominent hatchling in this article is SAM-PKK413, housed at the South African Museum, and was excavated from the Elliott Formation in 1961, and it is a, quote, largely articulated postcranial skeleton consisting of several cervical and dorsal vertebrae with their associated ribs, a nearly complete left forelimb along with pelvic fragments, and a partial left hind limb. One of the authors' observations was that, quote, perhaps the most interesting ontogenetic change in Massospondylus is related to the iconic thumb claw. BP1/5346 reveals that while much of the manus and pes are unossified, the first terminal digit is already well ossified in the embryo BP15346, possibly reflecting its functional importance early in ontogeny. Interestingly, the thumb claw is rather straight in the embryo BP15346, and it becomes slightly more curved in the hatchling SAM-PKK413 and continues to become more robust and dramatically more curved in more mature individuals. They continue, quote, there also appears to be proportionally greater growth in the thumb claw, and that of the robustness of the first digit relative to the corresponding digits in the embryo BP15346. In adult Massospondylus individuals, the robust and strongly curved first ungual likely reflects its functions related to feeding as well as defense, while the function of the straighter embryonic and hatchling condition remains unclear. However, given the probable ontogenetic postural shifts of Massospondylus, the thumb claw likely reflects ontogenetic variation consistent with varying behaviors of feeding and defense. So in this case, we know that they're quadrupedal, perhaps having a straighter thumb claw at a very young age is more conducive to it being on the ground all the time, whereas when it's bipedal, it can be more recurved and sharp and robust. So maybe it had more facility at a mature age than they did when it was juvenile. Man, that's a lot of prosauropod stuff in this episode. Okay, next we're progressing into the early Jurassic to the Sinemurian age, which spans somewhere between 199 and 191 million years ago. So there's 8 million years of wiggle room here. The next paper is Exceptional Early Jurassic Fossils with Leathery Eggs, Shed Light on Dinosaur Reproductive Biology, published in National Science Review in June 2024. The authors are excited to describe 3 adult skeletons and 5 clutches of embryo-containing eggs of a new sauropodomorph from southwestern China, displaying, quote, several significant reproductive features that are either unknown or unlike any early diverging sauropodomorphs, such as relatively large eggs with a relatively thick calcareous shell formed by prominent mammillary cones, synchronous hatching, and transitional pre-hatching posture between the crocodilians and living birds. And while interesting, the authors note that most significant is, quote, that these early Jurassic fossils provide strong evidence of the earliest known leathery eggs. Our comprehensive quantitative analyses demonstrate that the first dinosaur eggs were probably leathery, elliptical, and relatively small, but with relatively long eggshell units, and that along the line to living birds, the most significant change in reptilian egg morphology occurred early in theropod evolution rather than near the origin of aves. But don't let that interrupt us from meeting the new dinosaur Qian-Nan Zhang. The species is erected on the holotype GZPMVN001, housed at the Guizhou Provincial Museum, and it was excavated from the Ziluzhing Formation. It's comprised of a semi-articulated skeleton, including the partial skull and mandible. And then there are 2 partial semi-articulated skeletons and 5 clutches of embryo-containing eggs, too. The name means egg-guarding dragon from Guizhou, where Quan is Mandarin for Guizhou Province, and Long is Mandarin for dragon, and Shouhu is Mandarin for guarding. This guy sort of resembles Yunanosaurus, another Chinese early Jurassic sauropodomorph, maybe up to 30 feet long, but the authors are fully less interested in the morphology of this animal and dove hard into the eggs and embryos. They were far more interested in, quote, several novel findings pertaining to diapsid reproduction biology. 1. The early diverging sauropodomorph Qian-Nan has relatively large eggs with a relatively thick calcareous shell formed by prominent mammillary cones compared with other early diverging sauropodomorphs, a transitional pre-hatching posture between the crocodilians and living birds, and a synchronous hatching pattern. Note, mammillary cones are mammary-shaped cones in an egg that are not confusingly at all named after breasts because of their shape, but literally do not involve mammaries because this is the opposite of mammals, being an egg-laying dinosaur. But nonetheless, don't let that confuse you. 2, Qian-Nan and other early diverging sauropodomorphs have leathery eggs. Cool. 3, ancestral state recovery analyses, commonly called ASR, but obviously shouldn't be confused with automatic speak recognition, demonstrate that the first dinosaur eggs were probably leathery, elliptical, and relatively small, but with relatively long eggshell units, and that egg shape is generally conservative among extant birds, and the most significant change in reptilian egg morphology occurred early in theropod evolution. These findings are significant to our knowledge of the reproductive biology of diapsids, particularly of dinosaurs. It appears to have led eggs in breeding colonies, evidenced by this collection of fossils, with individuals potentially, quote, watching over their nests. They reiterate their support that Qian-Nan was similar to other early sauropodomorphs in being bipedal as an adult, but likely quadrupedal as juveniles. And reaching the latest point in our journey, maybe the youngest point, the most recent point in our journey in this episode, we arrive in Toarshin for our last article, approximately 182 to 174 million years ago, spanning 8 million more years. We've come almost 63 million years from the Carnian age of the Late Triassic, where we started with Saturnalia. That's almost the same amount of time from the end Cretaceous extinction event to today. That's a lot of time we're covering. The sauropodomorphs are reaching their end by this point, and the proper sauropods are about to begin their domination. Sauropodomorphs are big, but the sauropods become gigantic. By the Middle Jurassic, which comes next, the big guys will claim the Earth. But before we get to them, we have one last new sauropodomorph, Xingxiulong Wangi. In the article, The Largest Sauropodomorph Skull from the Lower Jurassic Lufeng Formation of China, published in Peyre J in December 2024, the authors describe a really big skull. The authors remind us, quote, the early Jurassic epoch was a crucial period in tracking the early radiation and diversification of sauropodomorph dinosaurs. Nearly all the non-sauropod and sauropodomorphs currently recovered in China are reported from Yunnan Province, and the LJLF is the richest fossil-bearing Mesozoic unit in the province. Although these Lufeng materials are well preserved and the abundance is high, they are underrepresented in comparative studies and cladistic analyses, especially the rare skulls. Here we report Xingxiulong Wangi from the LJLF of China, which is the Lower Jurassic Lufeng Formation, a new taxon that lies in the heart of the early sauropodomorph-sauropod transition. This new specimen, apart from possessing a combination of characters distinct from those of coeval dinosaurs, shows several unique characteristic traits of the skull and cervical vertebrae. Xingxiulong further increases the abundance of non-sauropod and sauropodomorphs, while providing more support for the Asian origin of sauropodoforms and indicating rapid radiation of this clade in southwestern China during the early Jurassic epoch. Recall, the title of this paper announces how big the skull of Xingxiulong is. The LFGTZLJ0011 skull is, quote, relatively large with thin, vertically supportive bones, but it appears to have been compressed fairly significantly during fossilization. They add that the skull is, quote, low and elongated in lateral view with an anteroposterior length of 40 centimeters, making it the largest cranial material recovered from the Lufeng Formation, while the previously largest is the skull of Xingxiulong, which is about 35 centimeters long, so 5 centimeters longer. That's a modest brag, but scientifically accurate. Feels a little bit like a clickbait title, eh? But more importantly, Dad, quote, Xingxiulong Wangi represents a new member of the seemingly ever-growing diversity of early sauropodoforms in the Lufeng dinosaur fauna. The accumulation of morphological data and phylogeny reconstruction results for non-sauropod and sauropodoforms allows us to conduct a quantitative analysis of the origin center and dispersal routes of this group. Furthermore, they possibly provide some new insights into paleogeographic mechanisms driving the early diversification of these dominant terrestrial herbivores, which have been appreciated only in relatively recent years. Because the skull is a bit larger, the author suggests, quote, it provides a reconsideration for phylogenetic analyses using individual specimens of ascertainable ontogenetic stages as operational taxonomic units to obtain better resolution in general, which I think is saying it could be handy in future phylogenetic analyses because it's bigger. But perhaps their final comment does a good job summarizing this episode on sauropodomorphs in general. Quote, our research has provided new insights into previous authors dealing with the anatomy of those Lufeng taxa, representing the first steps towards reevaluation of this famous dinosaur fauna. Moreover, the paleobiodiversity of early sauropodomorphs from Gondwana seems to decrease marginally after the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Recall, sauropodomorphs are popular in Africa, South America, and Europe until the early Jurassic, and then they're suddenly found in China. And note that they're also still found in North America, South America, Africa, and China, but the early Jurassic marks some sort of dispersal where they're also suddenly also found in Asia too. And this also tells some of the tale of the near sauropoda or sauropoda lineage. At least there is some evidence that, quote, at least the initial sauropoda-form lineages existed in southwestern China during the early Jurassic epoch. So, sauropodomorphs. We got a new specimen referred to Saturnalia, which shows that one of the earliest known sauropodomorphs had a shorter snout than they might have had imagined. The new Avedum banduavecchi demonstrates that sauropodomorphs already had widespread geographic distribution way back in the mid-late Carnian age. The new Hyracursor jiangwensis preserved an almost complete cervical series, which revealed that the acquisition of larger body size and neck elongation did not occur as separate sequential events, but were already linked by the earliest dinosaur occurrences in the late Carnian. And a study on pneumaticity showed a broad phylogenetic signal with increased development in later branching sauropodomorphs, but no link between pneumaticity and body size in early branching sauropodomorphs, even though there is a significant link in Jurassic sauropods way down the line. In the review of Leyesaurus and the finer interpretations of its anatomy suggests that it's more likely very closely related to the South African massospondylids from the Elliott Formation, and its initial interpretation as a Norian-aged sauropodomorph might be more accurately viewed as a Hatangian animal from the early Jurassic. And while that changed, the authors were able to say with even greater confidence that Leyesaurus is very closely related to Adiopaphosaurus, which is just a fun word to say, noting that the affinities between Adiopaphosaurus and Leyesaurus are undeniable. Through some much more detailed views on Plateosaurus specimens, some hypotheses on their behavior have been suggested, including the use of what would have been a formidable deterrent in a tail whip, as well as insights into the species' age of sexual maturity and types of bone infections they may have experienced throughout their lives. In one article that reviewed the Plateosaurus ornatus specimen, was surprised to find that it's not a prosauropod at all, but incredibly the oldest yet known evidence of thyreophorans, or thyreophorans, the armored dinosaurs, all the way back in the late Triassic. We learned that their ankles developed to bear the weight of a dinosaur gradually over a series of evolutionary steps, and that their wrists began with a full lineup of carpals and bones in their hands before they derived into non-existence, so their forelimbs could also bear the weight of being gigantic sauropods further down the line. A primitive craniomandibular analysis of an as-of-yet unnamed massapodon sauropodomorph may indicate that the early Jurassic massapodons that derive from the late Triassic of Asia may have had their origins beginning in Europe, maybe. In the early Jurassic, we gained a new species of Xingxiulong uiorum, which surprised the authors by having 4 sacral vertebrae back before sauropods were supposed to be evolving those sorts of things, suggesting that this, quote, discovery contributes to our understanding of the intricate patterns characterizing the early evolution of sauropodomorphs in Asia, and that the process of building up to 4 sacral vertebrae, quote, may be related to fitting the enlargement of the body size and providing better bone bearing. And in eastern China, the oldest sauropodomorph was named Wuding-Long Wui, further evidencing the taxonomic diversity and morphological disparity of sauropodomorphs as early as the earliest Jurassic. In the Massapodon papers, we had a big paper that looked to clarify which elements are diagnostic to try and make working on sauropodomorphs a bit easier, given that much of the historical work was due to be reviewed through a modern lens. The hopes are that future works accept these updates and the field can move forward with a clearer and more simplified lens on sauropodomorphs and Massospondylus. And then the next Massospondylus paper made interesting observations on the thumb and how it looked and perhaps operated throughout an individual's life. While the hands and feet are considered unossified or not yet bony while a hatchling, the thumb is well ossified in the embryo. This possibly reflects its functional importance in early ontogeny. It starts, quote, rather straight, and becomes, quote, slightly more curved, and then continues to, quote, become more robust and dramatically more curved in more mature individuals. This likely reflects, quote, its functions related to feeding as well as defense, while the function of the straighter embryonic and hatchling condition remains unclear. Though they added, quote, it likely reflects ontogenetic variation consistent with varying behaviors of feeding and defense. And the new Qian-Long nesting colony shows that the ancestral state of dinosaur eggs was leathery, and it's probable that, quote, recent evidence has suggested that the eggs of early dinosaurs may have instead had flexible, leathery shells, more similar to those of most lizards and some turtles, with rigid eggshells evolving several times in later dinosaur groups. It's added, quote, the eggshells of Qian-Long appear to have been leathery in structure, lending support to this hypothesis. And finally, the late Early Jurassic discovery of Xingxiulong Wang supports the hypothesis that, quote, at least the initial sauropodoform lineages existed in southwestern China during the Early Jurassic epoch. All right, after all that, I hope you feel like you're more caught up to date on what's been published on Sauropodomorphs lately. Thanks again for tuning in to Dinosaurs Lately. Merry Christmas, Christmas Eve. We have it today. If you'd like to find links to the materials discussed on today's show, you can visit dinosaurs-lately.blogspot.com, which is a companion piece to the Dinosaurs Lately podcast. My apologies to Dr. Paul Barrett, Dr. Alexander Verianov, Dr. Elisabetta Malafia, and Dr. Andre de Oliveira Francesca, and Dr. Remy Lefebvre, whom to each I owe a very special thank you for their correspondence over the last few episodes. Thank you to each for their support and congenial interest in sharing their research on dinosaurs with me. Dinosaurs Lately is a companion show to the Juras-Sick Park-Cast, the podcast where guests chat with me about Michael Crichton's 1990 novel Jurassic Park, and also Not That Too. If you'd like to be a guest on that show, you can reach me at ryansrogers@gmail.com. These podcasts are part of the Spring Chickens banner of amateur intellectual properties, including the Spring Chickens Funny Pages, Tomb of the Undead graphic novel, the Second Lapse graphic novel labs, The Infantry, and worst of them all, the King Street Capers. And you can find links to all that baggage in the show notes or by visiting the schickens.blogspot.com. And you can connect and follow on Facebook at facebook.com/springchickencapers, on YouTube by searching for the Juras-Sick Park-Cast podcast, or on Tumblr at Mr. Rogers22, on X at RogersRyan22, or on Blue Sky at RogersRyan22, bsky.social. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you feel you're all caught up on Sauropodomorphs for now. Until next time.